right, well, let's move on to something a little simpler for me, I hope, than Stalingrad, at least a little easier to cope with, which is Mighty Endeavor. This is the re-release, and as you can see, the original was limited to just this map, and now they've added a little Brittany sub-map because people complained and said, you should be able to invade in Brittany. Maybe. But more exciting to me is they added a hunk of Germany. Not because, I really want to be able to charge deeper into Germany as the Allies, but because the game has expanded to include the Ruskies and is running sort of as a battle for Germany type scenario. Not quite the same, but what it does is it allows the player who would normally be playing the Allied invasion to also be playing the defense against the Russian march on Berlin, and at the same time the player who would be playing the German defense is going to be playing the offense over with the Russians. The reason this is primarily of interest is for people who don't want to be stuck in kind of a low decision-making type of position. And honestly, I think the Germans didn't have a lot of exciting stuff to do in the original. So it made for a better solitaire game maybe than Opposed. However, I'm pretty excited about being able to play, both sides. I don't think it has quite the same cachet that the Battle of Germany did. And I actually picked this up with hopes that it would alleviate any need to pick that up, but I don't think it has. Okay. So what do we have? Well, this is a standard combat series game. It's been a while since I've played one of these. It's barely a series at all. Most of the rules are essentially, hey, this is your standard hex and counter war game. Here's how you move. Here's how you do certain things. Things like the CRT, they're different for each game in the series, or for many of the games in the series. Obviously, strength points can be modified somewhat. The graphics pretty standard for the gamers. Some people hate them. I'm okay with them. I don't think they're anything fantastic, but I think they're functional in general. One exception here is the counter graphics. See if we can see these. I find the particular font, and it looks fine there, this kind of bubbly looking font on the strength points. I find that kind of hard to read, and I'm actually finding, and this is probably just my eyes going, some of the numbers for the turn number. Let me explain what each position in the counter means. So like in Stalingrad, which we just did, we have an attack, a defense, and a movement. Great. Unit designation, over here, the letter E is in the setup position. Over here, you'll see this says turn 23 as the setup position for it. So reinforcements have a turn number on them. Other units have some kind of mark. Things that start on the map will be in a yellow box. And you'll have that with these guys. I had some problem because of the static infantry. The Brittany map, as far as I can tell, there's 2 of the starting static infantry that start on there. I didn't do it by individual unit for the static infantry. For everything else I did, I figured I'd catch up. But I also misplaced a couple, and I just made myself a nightmare when I was setting it up. Shit. I gotta be careful because my light is up against me, and I need to be able to wander around this map a little bit. So there's one more value on these counters. Just that little 2 in a circle. What the hell does that mean? Damned if I know. Let's look here. Probably something important. Okay. I don't see it there. Oh, that's how many steps the unit has. Yeah. Okay. So you'll see many units have 2 steps, and that means they'll have a flip over with 1 step. Some units only have 1 step, and they'll be destroyed when they lose it. All right, simple enough. You also have trucks in this game. You're going to have headquarters, but only for the Allies. And on the map, I guess one of the most important things, these little triangles, these are your victory point hexes. Those are the goals that the Allies need to get, and that's on both sides. This little red dividing line says the Russians cannot cross that. The Western Allies can't cross the other side. If the Western Allies are making it deep into Germany, they're going to be doing pretty well, though. The little red dashed areas over here, though, are different. These guys divide the game into air zones, and Western Allies are able to commit air superiority to an air zone. They're also able to do other things with their air markers. A few other little counters. We got our out of supply markers, or your airplane markers. This is covering Normandy. One of the reasons I have this beyond the battle for Germany thought was when I first, well, I've picked up a bunch of games since then, but basically I had very little that covers the Normandy invasion. Now, since then I've gotten that Operation Overlord, I don't remember what it's called, Guardian or something like that. We played that. It wasn't terribly interesting. I've got Fortress Europa. I bought this one's big cousin, which is still SCS, Day of Days, but is an SCS monster. And, well, I've had Omaha Beach for a while, the old Victor Games one, and that's pretty cool. And I don't know if France 44, I assume that covers the invasion as well. So that would also be qualifying. But the only D-Day game I think I've played, other than the grand strategic World War II games covering that have D-Day in them, is the Omaha Beach, which, you know, I feel like, wow, that's a pretty major thing to be missing. Notably, I do not think I own the Avalon Hill D-Day. I don't know if there's any particular reason to. All right, let's jump back just to confuse things. So there are little truck markers. Those are used by the Western Allies to extend their supply. I don't think the Russians have any now. And what else? Okay, we have these emergency attack markers. Those will allow you to make attacks when you're out of supply, which is kind of a cool thing. But like I said, because this is D-Day, that's where I was. We have these little markers to indicate the landing beachheads and mulberries, anything like that you want to talk about. Those are going to be handled by this, but then also as you capture ports as the Western Allies, and you're going to need these for supply, they become active after some time. So let's do a quick look at the series rules. I don't want to go into too much detail. I'm going to touch on anything I see as interesting. I'm assuming you know how to wargame and you're used to most of this stuff here. All effects are cumulative unless noted otherwise. Got a standard rounding rule. Anything 0.5 and up rounds up by 1. This is going to be important because primarily where it's really weird is because of the odds chart. The fog of war. You're not allowed to look at things in SCS. Your opponent's pieces. You can see the top unit on the stack. There's some rules as to what can be the top. I'm going to play kind of fast and loose with that because I walk away from the game for significant amounts of time. I want to be able to remember more or less what's there, but I also am not going to be counting trying to get exact odds. I'm just going to guesstimate what the odds are. I think that captures the feeling. You have a basic sequence of play. That's going to be changed in this game, so we won't talk too much about it. But it's got the standard movement, combat, and then an exploitation phase. And then you check supply. Zones of control cost you 2 extra movement points to enter an enemy zone of control. And as long as you got the movement points to do so, you can run right through them. However, in the exploitation phase, you have to be free of enemy zones of control to use that phase. If you retreat into or through an enemy zone of control, you lose steps as you do so. That's from the whole stack. Zones of control block supply unless you've got friendly units covering the supply. Movement's pretty standard. There's a terrain effect chart. Oh God, how am I going to read this? Maybe there's another copy of it here. But basically it gives combat effects that come from it. And it gives, well, it's got notes. It's got movement cost. We'll worry about that. There's a lot of different terrain in there, though. Some of it not too big a deal, but that's really tough to read. I hope there's another copy. No. Maybe there's somebody's got one online or something, because there's a lot of space used in these rule books. And again, gamer stuff, really nice stock to the rule book. You can write on it with pencil with no problem. But anyway, there's a fair amount coming with this game for the price and everything, but you really kind of, that's tough to read. Most of the rest of it, not so difficult. Yeah, we'll probably internalize it pretty quickly though. Okay, we hope. It may be hard when it's so small. Stacking. The game has its own stacking limit. Reinforcements show up where they do. There's some special rules for that. Overrun combat. Okay. When you're moving, after you pay zones of control to enter, so you can enter an enemy hex and attack. It's going to cost you 2 extra movement points to enter the enemy zone of control if there is one there. There will be one if the unit has combat factors. And it's going to cost you 2 extra movement points to make the overrun. Now, you can only overrun target hexes that'll cost 2 or less movement points to enter, and they actually specified here, use the target hexes terrain cost only, ignore enemy zones of control. That was something that I think confused me earlier, and I ended up saying, in a different SCS game, oh, that means you can only overrun garbage. That's not the case. The way the overrun basically works is you pay a couple extra movement points, and you get an attack in that hex. You do not get to move any further, though. And that's kind of a big deal. I think they may have actually changed this rule rather than that being a clarification. I'm not sure. It may have been different before. We're up on version 1.7. You can do this in either regular movement or exploitation. Normally, the only time you conduct combat is going to be in the combat phase, which sits between the movement and exploitation phase. So, in order to do combat and exploitation at all, you basically have to do an overrun. In order to do combat normally, you could do an overrun and follow it up immediately by another combat after your advance after combat or whatever. You can't use road movement to make the overrun. You don't actually enter the enemy hex. You move next to it. You conduct the fight as if you were entering it. You pay or as if you were next to it. You pay the points to enter it, though, and then you can advance. In fact, you may have to advance if you're doing an overrun. but regardless of the result, the overrun ends the regular movement for them, which doesn't feel like a normal overrun to me. It's basically a bonus combat. I'm not sure. I don't remember it being that way, but anyway. Your results are going to be expressed on the combat chart as a result to the attacker, a result to the defender. So this says attacker takes 1 step loss, defender takes 1 step loss, and retreats 1. You'll see these bracketed results. Those have a special effect due to the specific rolls. There's some restrictions on your steps lost. The first step taken, I believe, has to be from the side's strongest unit. And then, in that particular condition, but it's the raw strength. And then you have to take 1 step off of each unit before you can take a second step off of any additional. Well, nothing has more than 2 steps. Retreats. You're allowed to disregard retreat losses at a 1 step loss per retreat point that you've been assigned, if you so desire. Some restrictions on how you retreat, again, common to the system. The attacker can advance. He's allowed to advance as many spaces as the retreat value that was given, and that includes if there's a no retreat option taken if the defender is eliminated from the hex. There's going to be supply here. That's largely going to be system handled in the specifics of the game. Okay, we got 3 rule books for this one because we got the expansion, which covers this map, and Brittany. All right, what's here? So this looks like a big-ass rule book, right? It's actually mainly scenario rules. So we got about 12 pages of rules in here. I thought this was going to be too much for me to cope with, just in terms of, hey, I don't want to be reading a rule book for several days before I get started. It hasn't turned out that way. I was able to cover this pretty quickly. So, what do we have? If there's multiple types of terrain in a hex, you pay the most expensive. The defender gets to use the best terrain for him. The one exception to that is forts, which I think are these little blues, which only help the Germans. And they double in addition to any other terrain bonuses that might exist for them. German defenders in the forts can also choose to just ignore a retreat result if they want. They can take it, but they don't have to. Sea lines, I believe that's these dark blue things. They just indicate, hey, you can't move from here to here, you can't fight there. Unless there's a road or bridge going across them. All right, so where roads cross water, there's an implied bridge, but it's not any kind of special bridge. There are also these special bridges, which we look up on the chart, and they cost an extra movement point to cross. Roads, you get to be using road movement to cross them, or whatever. You cannot attack across the Rhine or sea lines unless there's a road or bridge crossing. There's no blowing bridges in this. Stacking is 4 units. Headquarters, trucks, and markers don't count. However, headquarters and trucks will count for shipping limitations. And stacking is enforced only at the end of regular movement and overrun combat. You're allowed to temporarily overstack at other times. This is really important because in your shipping phase, you're allowed to put a pile of troops into a port at times. Units that have a yellow bottom are exploit capable. These are generally armor, but not exclusively. That's going to mean that they're allowed to use the exploit movement phase, and they can only do it if they're in supply. Okay. Get replacement points each turn. Now here are this is listed, and unfortunately I've got all these units all over here, but this is listed for each player. So like the US gets 2 replacement points there, the Brits get 1, the Germans get 2. These don't carry over, and they're in steps. You can replace your best stuff first. Basically, things have to be in supply to be replaced. If you want to rebuild a unit, you can do that. You can rebuild it from scratch and build both steps if you have 2 replacement points. I think they have to be in a headquarters in that case. You can also build them in either the med box or the English box, obviously, if you're the Allied player, Western Ally. Now, there's going to be withdrawals listed in the sequence of play. I got to be careful about how that works, but I think they probably mostly refer to moving units over to deal with the extra map. But they would have been here anyway to handle the Russian problem, even with the 1 map game. Now they're just integrated so that they actually move over there. I think. I'm not sure. Okay, supply is weird. So there's a regular trace supply that works kind of as the standard game does, with a few exceptions. If you're out of trace supply, you get an out of supply marker. You won't be allowed to attack normally, but you can move at half your movement allowance and defend at half your movement allowance, rounded off. You're no longer exploit capable. You cannot take replacements. Allied units do not die from being out of supply. This is something Dean likes to do. He doesn't like units just dying due to supply problems, because that generally didn't happen during the era. So you kind of have to put force on something to destroy it. Of course, it's weakened without the ammo flow and whatnot. But all right. German units, though, that are out of supply for 2 turns in a row on the West map will surrender. You're able to invoke a Defend the Reich option, however, which gets rid of that, but it means that your supply line is limited to, I think, 10 hexes to get yourself across the Rhine and into Germany. There's also these emergency attack markers, and you have a very limited amount. Germans have 2. Allies have a stack of them. They're one-use things. You can put it on a hex, and now you can attack that hex as if you're fully in supply. Any units that attack that hex are in supply. I'm hoping that they're all available for this scenario, because that's what I assumed. There's a strategic movement option. If you don't start in an enemy zone of control and don't enter one, and don't get out of supply, well, don't end out of supply, you can double your movement allowance. You can use this only in the normal movement phase. If you're an exploit unit, you can then still use the exploit phase, but you don't get to strategic move in it. Trucks and headquarters cannot use it, and you can't execute overruns. Every now and then, Dean decides, wow, people aren't playing this game well because, honestly, the victory conditions don't express everything you want them to do. Well, here he's put some victory conditions in place to prevent some weird play. In particular, the Germans cannot run away from Paris. If the Allies take Paris before turn 8, they get 18 extra victory points. However, this is negated if the Allies create a beach port in the North Coast Hex east of the Seine, and that's possible. A good reason not to make landings at Calais or something is it does allow the Germans to just say, and run away. The advantage to them running away, one of them is they can use the Defend the Reich rule if they're falling back. None of the victory points are out there. the victory points are all kind of in the Rhineland area and east. So, all right. Now there's some exemptions to that beyond that. This rule, there was another exemption to it. This rule only exists to keep the Germans from cutting and running. Should the Germans lose Paris early in spite of a good faith effort to retain it, do not award these points. Running and leaving some crappy little garrison doesn't count as good faith. Again, 18 points is actually pretty close to, it's not an auto victory, but it's gonna get you a lot of the way towards victory. So don't lose Paris, but if you try real hard not to lose it, then you're safe. What the limits are, not specified. It's an Essig game. He likes to play kind of fast and loose with those things. Okay. At the end of movement or exploitation, the Commonwealth, including the Poles, can't stack with U.S. and French units, or vice versa. They can stack during movement or for overruns, but they must separate before the stack ends. You're able to clump them together at other times. Headquarters can only provide attack supply to units of their nationality set, Commonwealth or U.S. Doesn't matter for shipping. You can share headquarters for trace supply. Airborne units and truck markers are exempt from these restrictions, and all the truck markers are marked as U.S. Only the Allied player has headquarters. Headquarters have a supply function. If they're destroyed, they come back in the next reemplacement and reinforcement phase at any other headquarters. They can't use strategic movement. They don't have a combat factor except for a small defense strength. And they have a supply range instead of a combat factor written in brackets. This is how far you can reach back and cast supplies forward. Reach back to draw supplies and cast them forward. An attack headquarters is a headquarters that's been flipped over to its attack side. Let's get ourselves a headquarters here. So here, this has a 5-hex range. Here, this is flipped to the attack side. It says attack on it. It has a lower movement point allowance, and it will allow units that trace supply through it to attack. It's based on nationality. Each functional port or beach port can only support one attack headquarters. The port must be connected via one or more trucks, or maybe connected, or you can directly connect. Antwerp and Rotterdam are each allowed, one of them is allowed to attack headquarters. And they flip back when it's no longer important. Okay. Antwerp and Rotterdam cannot be used as ports if the estuaries, which are these little diamonds, are covered for that particular port. If the estuary is cut off with German units, you're not going to be able to use it as a supply port for any reason. And those two and Boulogne-sur-Mer can only be used, only one of the 3 ports can be used for attack supply, which is why I said only one of the 2 can give you 2. Yeah. All right. Beach ports, when you land an invasion, you get a beach port marker placed, and it'll stay for 6 turns. It's unaffected by adjacent enemy units, but if somebody enters it, it will be destroyed and could be reestablished with a new counter. But they're going to be allowed to give you trace supply, attack supply, and inbound shipping, but you can't use them for direct shipments or outbound shipping. When you capture a port, when you first enter that hex, you roll a die, and that's how many turns that the port's little marker is put ahead. on the board, on the game turn track. It will be available as a fully functional port once that turn is reached. It can give you trace supply, but it can't give you unit shipping or support attack headquarters. If a beach port exists in the same hex as the functional port, only one of the two can be used for the turn. If the Germans recapture a port, the functional marker stays where it is. And then if the Allies recapture it before that turn, they roll a die. And that's how many turns later that the port would be functional, unless the original was further out. Basically, it's a way to prevent you from, oh shit, I got a 6? Yeah, let's give that up to the Germans and take it back. Functional ports and beach ports allow shipping of 1 unit per turn. The beach port has some differences there. We'll talk about that in a little bit. That's the beach class invasion cycle, which they kind of mentioned there. A unit is basically a combat unit, a headquarters, or a truck. I'm going to have to swap batteries out here. Took that moment to refresh my pipe too. All right. Shipping. Units in England can ship to a functional port or beach port along the Atlantic, the Channel, or North Sea. Units in the Med, into the Med coast. No big. You can't go to the other. The Allies have enough shipment to ship however many ports worth of shipping they have. If you're stacked in a functional port during the shipping phase, you can also go home. Direct shipments. These are reinforcements that can arrive at a functional port if desired. They will have a D on the reinforcement chart. So I'm going to have to look up the reinforcement chart. And they'll say north or south, in which case they either go to the Med or, well, they either go to the Atlantic or the Med. And you can't delay them and move them to the other front. So you really kind of have to, you're going to have to do a southern invasion here. Allied supply. Okay, trace supply and attack supply are differentiated. Supply lines have to be traced to a given unit and back to a supply source using the headquarters supply range. Okay, traced forward to a given unit from the headquarters and back to the supply source. And that'll be using the headquarters supply range. Units in England or the Med boxes are always in supply. The source is going to be a port. And you can go to friendly non-functional ports for trace supply, but not for attack supply. The range is it movement points? Yeah, the range is movement points. Enemy zones of control block trace supply, but friendly units can protect that. The Allied supply source I've already talked about. Trucks are going to be supply extenders. They give an extra 5 movement points, I think. Let's see. What do they say it on them? Yeah, they give an extra 5 movement points. I don't know if they all do, but that's my assumption. So the supply range of a headquarter back to a truck, and then the truck can supply back to a truck or port, continuing back. The Allies get air points, which they will roll on the air support table based on the turn. And they can use those points to dominate an air zone. They drop it into one of these air zones, and now they'll get certain advantages from that. That costs 1 of their arrow points. It will cause roads to cost a full movement point instead of a half for German units. It allows them to make airdrops. If they use supporting air points, they get 2 column shifts instead of 1. And here's the interesting one. Armor and Panzer Grenadier units conducting strategic movement pay twice the normal movement point cost for all hexes in a dominated zone. This cancels the 2 times movement bonus within a dominated zone. So if they do strategic movement, they will lose their advantage entirely. So there's no reason to do strategic movement. This does not say anything about them being German units. Which to me, I mean, they go out of their way. Road hexes cost for German units. So my assumption is armor units for the Allies are going to have the same effect. You can also use points for ground support, and they will shift 1 column on combat, or 2 if you have a dominant zone. You can't use them in a landing attack of an invasion. You might say, wait, there was a lot of air support. Yeah, it's factored in. The invasions don't follow normal combat rules. Let's just put it that way. Right. Okay. If you shift beyond 7+, you don't get any bonus. You can only use 1 air point normally. But once in the game, the Allies can declare a carpet bombing attack, which allows them to use as many air points as they like to shift their odds. And this cannot be an overrun. The Allied player also gets airdrop points at the start. And each airdrop point allows them to drop 1 of their airborne divisions. They can drop up to 2 units in a single hex, up to 3 in a turn. You roll a die for them. If it'll lose a 1, it'll lose a step if, this is per unit, if dropped in open terrain on a 1, or a 1 or 2 if you're dropping it in Bocage or a hex that's in a zone of control of a German unit. Any other roll unit lands. If you drop into an enemy unit, not only do you have to roll if there's a zone of control there, which there probably is, you must attack, and the airborne unit only has half strength. If you fail to dislodge the Germans, the airborne unit will be destroyed. However, you are allowed to drop it next to a German unit, higher chance of losing a step, and then you can attack at full strength. They can't move on the turn they land, and they're in the supply phase of the turn they drop. They do not require attack supply on the turn they land. Okay, now this, one of the few times a Dean Essig rule hasn't made a lot of sense to me, is the invasions rule. It took me a while to figure it out. It's exactly what it says, but it's not exactly intuitive. The Allied player can make as many invasions in the game as he has remaining beach port markers. You have a pile of them to start with, and I should probably put them over there. No more than 3 can ever be created on a single game turn. You're free to use those markers singly or in groups at any time during the game. You can only use them once to conduct an invasion unless the invasion fails. Invasions can occur in most coastal hexes. The hex will have a starred number, which is the beach port class. That is going to determine how many forces can be landed on a successful invasion. And this is spelled out here. Invading units don't require any special attack supply. They cannot move on the turn they invade. To execute the invasion, you put the beach port marker with the number of assault force divisions you want to send in adjacent to the landing hex. You can only use infantry. You have to apply your cooperation. Whatever the case, even if they're, whether they're defending units or not, you're going to be attacking on an odds table based on the terrain listed up here. So fortress and wetlands are a little harder. Everything else is pretty easy. Gets you on the 2-to-1 table. If the attack succeeds in clearing the landing hex, i.e. causing enough casualties to whatever German units are there or forcing them to retreat, that it's empty, and if there are still assault force units left, you can land and the invasion succeeded. You're allowed to land for free without making an attack roll into hexes occupied by non-airborne allied units, but otherwise you have to make an invasion attack and you may lose units. If the attack fails, the units in the beachport marker go back to the box in which they came from, the units taking whatever losses they would have from the combat results table. The beachport can keep being used as long as you keep failing. Okay, the beach class indicates what forces can be landed in the initial assault. And remember, these have to survive. You have to still have forces left when you succeed in your invasion, or else you didn't succeed. Then immediately that turn, you can drop that many more forces in. Now, you got to worry about stacking. No, you don't. And then on the next turn after, in the case of a class 3 port, you can land 2 units instead of the usual 1. All right, what about the Germans? Special rules. Reaction restrictions. What? None. I don't know. I guess the assumption is that there should be some scripting in a D-Day type situation, and they just want to make sure. Nope, there isn't. Okay, tactical adeptness. When the Germans attack, if they get one of these bracketed values, it doesn't affect, it affects them 1 less than it would normally affect. So this wouldn't affect them at all. If there's like an A2, there's one that would only do 1 step loss. This is to give them a little bit more capability and a little bit more reason to launch counterattacks. German supply. All right. Supply is unlimited in terms of the range for German units in France until later. Until it's not. You don't need an attack headquarters. You can attack as long as you're in supply. Ports don't affect them. However, one thing that is in play, and this, I'm not sure I agree with the way this is shown, but okay. German units do not negate enemy zones of control for trace supply if 2 opposite hexes are occupied by allied units, which project a zone of control. Okay, 180 makes it sound like they're 180 degrees apart. Here, hey, we're safe. Here, okay, we got allied units on both sides. This German unit is not going to be able to trace through any of the hexes involved, so they will be out of supply. Remember, Germans go away when they're out of supply. How quickly? Have we hit the surrender? Yeah. If they're outside, but that's for 2 turns in a row that they have this problem. The one that confuses me is this picture here. This one, that's fine. I won't be able to trace through these hexes. This one, yeah, I wouldn't be able to trace through this, but I'm not sure I believe the 180 rule there. That's the thing that kind of gets me. And I understand what they're trying to say. I don't understand how to apply that to the words of the rule that are there. Unless you say, well, these 2 are on opposite sides of the unit somehow. I don't know. Anyway, entry area A. The Germans have a lot of entry area A spaces. The reinforcements that come in entry area A come in through there. the hex is occupied by a German unit, or the last unit to move through it was German, and the hex can, I assume they all start with that being the case, but it doesn't specify. The hex can trace a path free of enemy units and enemy zone of control to a supply source. If both these conditions are not met, the hex cannot be used to bring on reinforcements. Well, if no entry in Area A hex exists, the German reinforcements can be scheduled to enter an east map edge north. Okay, so entry Area A gets modified when we play with the extension, though. So we'll talk about that a little later. The German player has a defend the right counter. Once he plays it, it's in effect till the end of the game. The German lines of supply can only go 10 hexes and must enter Germany to be valid. All of Germany is a supply source, I guess. Cannot cross prohibited terrain, but otherwise it can ignore movement point costs. It's a hex count. The hex in Germany must connect to a path free of enemy units to a supply source hex. The secondary trace can be of any length. What were the German supply sources? I forgot about those. East map edge, provided the hex doesn't have an allied. Now that's the east map edge of this map, and again, that may get modified a little bit. Okay, the German surrender rule gets suspended here. No German forces will be forced to surrender anymore, and the 180 rule goes away as well. However, the problem is you end up tethered to Germany. You can't extend that at all, so this is like when you're ready to fall back into the Rhineland and defend, the last vestiges of, your victory point spaces when it comes down to it. When you're ready to give up to go down to there, this is the rule that takes place. And honestly, after turn 8, you probably kind of want to be heading that way, if not before. Okay. Victory in general is determined by how many victory point spaces the Allies have. And remember, it's 18 if the Germans give up Paris for no reason. Okay, now to the expansion. And this adds those hordes of Russian red units there. All right. The Eastern Axis never gets any replacement points. They just get newly formed units. German replacement points from the West can't be used in the East. Well, it makes sense because it's the guy who's making those units die who would be spending them. So obviously they wouldn't want to. The Soviets are going to get replacement points listed on their order of arrival, and they'll be specified by given unit types. That's not on there. It's only in the expansion book. There are no emergency attacks. The east-west boundary line, I think that's this sucker. No unit can cross that boundary. That's an edge of the map thing. Some German units will be transferred to the Eastern Front from the Western Front. These units will not have Eastern Front stripes on it. I forgot to explain that. Yeah, so to aid setup, there's, I don't know if you can see it, a little tiny white stripe on the top of these units. Those are the East Front units. The West Front units like this one do not have that. And the East Front units will always be on the East Front, but you may get some West Front units that slide into the East Front. Oh, there's no way to play the East map only. You'd have to make up rules to do that if for some reason you wanted that. Okay. The East Edge entry zone. The Axis units cannot move into the East Edge entry zone areas marked with a purple dotted line. It looks like this. If they enter there as reinforcements, they must leave as fast as possible. If they're forced to retreat into it, their counter is destroyed. The Axis unit can attack into there, but it can't advance or overrun. 2 German units are removed from play at one time and re-enter later as reinforcements. These units will re-enter at full strength no matter how weak they left the board. The Soviet forces can all operate together. They don't have any coordination problems. The Soviets have headquarters, though, and they flip over to attack side. The way this is done is each headquarters has a role made for it. On a 5 or 6, it's attack capable. Otherwise, it stays non-attack capable. It remains attack capable, though, if it doesn't commit an attack. So Russian headquarters could come on, find out they're attack capable, and not support any attacks in order to keep that attack capability for later turns when maybe they can use it more effectively. This is different from how the West works. Soviet units are in supply if they're within supply range of a Soviet headquarters. The Soviet headquarters can trace any distance back to the east map edge, to a road along the east map edge. Now, the headquarters must be on a road hex themselves. Soviet supply sources are the 5 road hexes on the eastern map. Entry areas C to G. I guess this road even? 4040? Does that count? (4141). Yeah, that one counts. Okay. There's no air power on the east front, but for the west front, the Allied Zone 4 here extends through Germany. If you get that far. Let's see, what else do we have? Soviets don't have airdrops. They cannot move in such a manner to place themselves out of supply if they could move or stay in supply. If they have anywhere they can move to that's in supply, they must do so. This doesn't affect advance after combat, and if they have no in-supply options, they can move at will. On any attack by the Soviet player, you double the losses, the actual step losses, for both sides. This is to represent a couple of things: heavier artillery that the Soviets had, as well as their units being less well trained. The tactical adeptness rule, which is the brackets, applies to the Germans on the east map, but the 180 rule does not. Nor I think does the surrender rule, right? I don't know. The Germans trace their supply on both cases to the east-west boundary line. If it makes it to the line, it's safe. Western Area A reinforcements. These can enter any Area A hex on the western map, which is not under the new eastern map edge. So some of the A hexes have been covered up. Defend the Reich cannot be used here. Crippled remnants. Okay, each Axis unit that comes from an eastern map entry area, marked with an asterisk on the Axis reinforcement chart, like this, I guess, rolls a die and sees if it takes further loss or takes losses. German units that are transferred from the west to east will be plucked off the map by the West German player in reinforcement or replacement, and they show on a city east of the east-west boundary line on the next turn as a reinforcement. They get railed or whatever very quickly. You can remove units that cannot trace supply and are reduced strength. Reduced strength is a really good idea because you're putting weaker units in your own way. Right? Yeah. Dead units cannot be chosen, however. If there's not enough units in play, you remove one of a similar or higher value. And you have to choose Panzer, Panzer Grenadiers in that order first. The transfers arrive in the East in whatever state they were in. However, they lose their out of supply. Okay. Each German player turn at the beginning of the German reinforcement and replacement phase, when a supplied non-airborne Allied unit is adjacent to or east of the Rhine River while inside Germany, the Allied player rolls a die. Divide that result by 2 and round up. This is the number of steps that the Western German player must destroy from his units. He can choose any German unit or units west of the east-west boundary line to take the losses. This represents, obviously, the mass surrenders that happened as the Germans felt like they were falling and they were afraid they might be thrown into the East Front. But it also serves as a governor to prevent the Germans from just letting units across the Rhine. So that's kind of cool. Victory points will be determined by adding up the points on each map. And if the Russians beat the Western Allies, then the player who is defending Western Germany and playing the Russians wins, and vice versa. You don't have to compare your victory point total to some fixed value. It's a comparison of how the two players did. Now, given that there are basically two separate games going on, with the exception of the fact that damaged units can be transferred to the east, there's not really, it doesn't really make much difference whether it's against a fixed value or not. But, it adds a little to the competitive situation. If one player's better at attack and and another's better at defense, at least they both get to, show their strengths or whatever in any given place. It's not really a balancing factor in terms of I don't know. I don't know what I'm saying. But basically, you might think, if the Germans were getting wailed on by the Russians, they would probably shift more troops. And that's probably the case. However, that would spoil the game unless that generated victory points. And you'd have to have all kind of rules and all kind of gaminess there. Obviously, I'm not starting this tonight. It's my bedtime. Probably tomorrow morning. But give you guys a chance to look at this, and we'll send it up.